I'm not sure when it began. Perhaps it was the day Damien was born, and my parents treated him like a present from the sky while I stood there as a 2-year-old, already forgotten. Or perhaps it was years later when Damien damaged my favorite toy truck, and I was banished to my room for no apparent reason. I used to believe that all families were like this. Maybe I was overly sensitive or just seeing things, but as I grew older, it became impossible to deny the fact that my parents treated us differently. Damien was the golden child, and no matter what he did, he could do no wrong. When he got into trouble at school, my parents brushed it off. Oh, boys will be boys. But if I misplaced a school assignment, I'd receive an hour-long lecture about responsibility. If Damien was feeling down, he got a new video game console, a bicycle, even a ticket to an amusement park. Meanwhile, I had to work for everything. When I turned 12, I asked for a new set of soccer cleats for my birthday. My dad sneered, saying that brand names weren't important, but the year Damien threw a fit because he wanted designer sneakers, he got them. For years, I convinced myself that maybe I was just different, less likable than my sibling. But the pattern didn't just continue as we got older. It got worse. When I turned 16, I started working part-time at a grocery store. I worked weekends and after school to save money for my own car, something my father was proud of. He even helped me out with a used vehicle, matching what I had saved. I was thrilled, incredibly proud of that car. 2 years later, when Damien turned 16, my parents bought him a brand new car. No savings, no part-time job, just a direct gift. I still remember standing in the driveway that day, watching him start the engine. My dad patted him on the back and said, "A young man needs to drive in style." College was the real wake-up call. No matter what I did, it was never enough. I put in the effort, got high grades, and earned a partial scholarship to a prestigious university, something my parents barely acknowledged. My mom just said, "Well, you were always the serious one," while my dad mumbled, "That's good." Meanwhile, Damien barely got into community college, and they threw him a huge celebration, a car, a congratulations party, and of course, an expensive new laptop to help with his studies. I couldn't afford gas, so I rode my bike 5 miles to work every day. But despite all of this, I still craved their acceptance. A part of me believed that if I just worked harder, accomplished more, they would finally see me. But Damien never had to try. He dropped out after 1 semester. Figuring out who he was, my parents called it. They praised him for defying social norms. They funded his trips, his failed business ventures, his dreams, while I worked 2 jobs and drowned in student debt. The holidays were the worst. I'd walk in, exhausted from work, and my mother would say, "Oh, you look tired. Have you been working too much?" Meanwhile, Damien would stroll in, bragging about his latest big idea, some non-existent business venture. My parents would light up, hanging on to his every word. They treated me like I was boring, just safe, even though I was advancing in my career, paying off my debts, and building a real future for myself. Damien was always the one they enjoyed talking about. I remember one Thanksgiving. I had just received a promotion, my first real step into management. I sat down at the dinner table, hoping, just this once, they'd acknowledge it. I barely got a sentence out before my mother cut me off to talk about Damien's latest idea, starting a podcast. They spent the next hour discussing that. That night, I went home, stared at the ceiling, and wondered why I even tried. But the truth is, I still love my brother. I hated how my parents treated me, but I never blamed him. He didn't ask for the favoritism. He just benefited from it. So I kept in touch. I called him, asked how he was doing, invited him to hang out. But every time, it felt one-sided. If I talked about my work, he'd brush it off. But if he was dating someone new, my parents acted like he had just discovered the cure for cancer. He'd casually mention his mystery supermodel girlfriend, a woman no one had ever met. I should have recognized the warning signs. But I didn't, because everything was always a competition. And I spent my entire life trying to earn his love. Was so used to losing to him that I never imagined he'd take away the one thing I truly cared about. Hannah. I met her through Damien. Looking back, that should have been a red flag. But she wasn't like the other women he kept around. She wasn't. Caught in his orbit. She wasn't laughing at his jokes just to stroke his ego. She was looking at me. For the first time, someone saw me. We spent the whole night talking. And when we started dating, for the first time in my life, I felt important. Hannah was brilliant, hard-working. She understood what it meant to fight for every inch of success. She saw the small things, like how I tapped my fingers when I was thinking, or how I got quiet when I was upset. She once asked me, "Why do you always do that?" "Do what? Act like your accomplishments don't matter. You worked hard for that promotion. Why downplay it?" I didn't know what to say, because if you spend your whole life being told your achievements don't matter, eventually, you believe it too. But with Hannah, I finally felt enough. My family wasn't happy for me. Of course not. When I introduced Hannah to them, my mom forced a polite smile and said, "Oh, she's very pretty," in that tone that meant she was looking for something to criticize. My dad barely acknowledged her before going back to his football game. And Damien? At first, he wasn't obvious, but looking back, I should have seen the way he watched her. The way he asked about our relationship, not in a brotherly way, but in a calculated way. I ignored it, because for the first time, I was happy. And for once, I had something Damien couldn't take from me, or so I thought. Because Damien wasn't. Satisfied with just being the favorite son. He needed everything, and soon I would find out just how far he'd go to take it. Wedding planning is a lot of work and stressful for both of us, but it's typical for couples to have busy lives. Since Hannah was the first person to ever make me feel important, I chose to disregard the warning signs throughout this time. I didn't want to think that emotion was fading. The warning signs I overlooked, when I looked back, were all there. The way she would promptly lock her phone as soon as I entered the room. The unexpected scent on her clothing that wasn't hers. On those evenings, she would return home smelling, like cologne and wine. And how, on one night, that should have allowed me to witness everything, she kissed me as if she were no longer there. For whatever reason, I was waiting for her in bed at 2 in the morning, and she was still not home. At last she came in, her hair disheveled, her cheeks flushed, and her shoes in her hand. When I questioned if she was with her best friend Emily, she froze for a little while. I should have said something. To the same Emily who had contacted me earlier that evening to see if Hannah was home, I pushed, but I just nodded and moved on. Because when you love someone, you start to believe things that aren't true. Then came Damien. His presence became more frequent. And soon, he was constantly around, constantly inquiring about Hannah's well-being. She appears to be under stress. You should treat her with respect, man. She's far too good for you. I mistakenly believed those were just jokes, but now I realize they were actually warnings wrapped in humor, and one day, I walked in on them. Hannah appeared remorseful, and Damien only grinned at me as they conversed in the kitchen alone. He spoke nonchalantly about the wedding as if nothing was wrong. As if I hadn't just entered a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. But since Hannah was the woman I loved, and Damien was my brother, I ignored it. Something might have been going on between them. The night everything nearly fell apart was unimaginable. I finally plucked up the courage to ask Hannah what was going on one night after feeling strange. For weeks, we were in the living room. I watched her, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. My heart was racing. "Hannah, are we all right?" She hardly looked up. "Why? You've been different, haven't we?" I asked. She sighed, put down her phone, and reached for my hand. "I'm just exhausted from all the stress, work and the wedding." For a moment, I believed her, but then her phone buzzed. She winced. My stomach dropped. I saw the name on the screen before she could turn it around. Damien. I just stared at her, expecting an explanation. Expecting her to tell me I was overthinking, but she simply picked up her phone, placed it on mute, and acted as if nothing had happened. I spent the following months persuading myself that nothing was wrong. I suppressed my doubts, because I was satisfied that Hannah still loved me, that Damien was only my brother. I pushed it deep away, so I wouldn't have to see it. Because if I confronted the truth, I'd have to acknowledge that the life I was creating was already disintegrating. And although I wasn't prepared to lose everything just yet, I think, deep down, I already knew. Do you ever feel like everything is tilting? Like the ground beneath your feet no longer feels solid? As though you've been building something real for years, something strong, only to see it fall apart in an instant? Because the night Hannah revealed her pregnancy to me was the night she became a stranger. In the months leading up to the bombshell, I would see her deep in thought, gazing off into space in our home. And when I asked what was wrong, she would simply shake her head and say she was exhausted. That was her answer to everything. I began to hate that word. Tried. God knows I tried. Cutting back on work, planning date nights to win her back. She smiled. She said the right things. But her gaze was colder, as if she had already left for another place. I remember that it was a Wednesday night. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted. All I wanted to do was collapse on the couch and pretend nothing was wrong. But as I entered, she was sitting there, her hands clenched in her lap. Her voice was shaky. I need to tell you something. My stomach dropped. My heart pounded. All right, I whispered. She refused to look at me. Then she said it. I'm pregnant. For a brief moment, I felt relief. I smiled, because despite everything, it was strangely comforting. I reached for her. We're going to be parents, I murmured. But then, I noticed how her body tensed under my touch, how her breath caught in her throat, and I knew. Then, she muttered the words that shattered me. It's not yours. Hannah's face crumpled. The room tilted. I withdrew my hand, as if she had burned me. Everything broke. She gasped, acting as if she were the victim. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't need to hear the rest. I already knew. Before she even spoke his name. Damien. Every breath felt like fire in my lungs.